I was able to stack up 18,286 points for damaged ground-based arc enemies during a night raid on Stella Montis. Now for my equipment, I brought in a Venator and a Hole Cracker, both with 7 stacks of ammo, 2 light shields, 8 stacks of adrenaline shots, a deadline, and a snap hook. Now before we jump into the strategy, we need to cover the RNG components that are going to affect your ability to earn score in this run. First and foremost, the Bastion in Loading Bay is not a guaranteed spawn. It will trade off with a Vaporizer, so you need to figure out whether or not you have a Bastion that's spawned in.
Yeah, it
Getting a
sucks.
full Bastion elimination will give you about 2,000 points, so it is very, very worth it to get that farm. Additionally, comets will spawn with the Bastion, but not with the
I think it's just
Vaporizer. So
random.
you not only would lose the points of not having the Bastion, but also the comets that come with it. On top of that, there are a few areas on the map where shredders will or will not spawn, just totally randomly based on whether or not the match has decided they're going to spawn in during that round. The atrium can have 2 shredders, but it is very, very rare for them to spawn in. At least it is for me. Business Center has 1 shredder that will or will not spawn, just dependent on your RNG. The metro area has an RNG spawn for shredders. It's a lot higher of a frequency than the other 2 for sure. The Seed Vault Extraction will spawn 1 shredder midway through the game, but that is also dependent on whether or not the match has decided a shredder should spawn in during that round. Additionally, I have seen the Robotic Sandbox A not always have 2 shredders, but I haven't been able to figure out whether or not that's RNG or just somebody took out a shredder, left the other one alive, and then they got into an odd spawning behavior where one was up at all times. So the challenge here is that there is a ton of RNG, and it really is just a dice roll for whether or not you're going to get the spawns that you need to set an ultra high score. The 18k I got includes the Bastion spawn, but I didn't have the Atrium spawns, and I didn't have the Business Center spawn, and I had somebody in lobby that was farming shredders when they spawned in, so I really didn't have the most amount of shredders to farm throughout this run. This is likely a more realistic score for all of you. I'm honestly a little gassed out on trying to get the most best perfect lobby ever. I'm tired of queuing in and just leaving and re-queuing, trying to get the most perfect scenario to score the highest amount of points to put that on my socials. It doesn't give y'all a realistic picture as to what you're going to deal with when you attempt this challenge. And my goal is to provide you with a much more realistic perspective on what is possible in the challenges when you don't always get a perfect lobby to yourself. On top of all the RNG I've already talked about, there's also the RNG of players PvPing. And during the middle of this game, I got hunted for a few minutes out of the round by a player that wanted to take me out. I'm going to walk y'all through the strategy here overall, and then walk you through the PvP encounter and help you understand some tactics that you can use to try and get away from a player that is trying to take you out. Once you spawn in, you essentially want to beeline it for the loading bay. Getting to the loading bay and figuring out whether or not there's a Bastion that spawned in is really, really important. But additionally, getting that elimination before other raiders can show up and deal damage is super important and boost your score. Now I got fairly lucky with my spawn. I spawned in Atrium, and there's a drop down into the Robotic Sandbox area, and then I could walk through the control room above the sandboxes to drop down into the loading bay, which helped me avoid a lot of the fighting on my way. Now keep in mind, in the beginning of the round, the loading bay is hyper aggressive. There is a ton of enemies around, and the second you attack any one of them, most of the other enemies are going to aggro to you. While you do want to try and hurry up and get the Bastion taken out, you don't want to try and do it to put yourself into a risky spot by letting all those enemies roam for free. You really need to focus those down and make sure that you have a clear shot at getting the deadline on it before you actually go for it. I highly recommend using the Hole Cracker to deal with 99% of the enemies out in the loading bay. The only time I would recommend using the primary is for things like pops and fireballs. Otherwise, the Hole Cracker is going to deal with all the other enemies the best, and you really need to be sure to manage the ammo inside the magazine of the Hole Cracker. You don't want to find yourself totally empty, because comets will like to come up behind you, as well as enemies that you may have aggroed coming in from another area. In a night raid, the enemies are a lot more aggressive, so they're a lot more prone to following you into those areas once you've aggroed one or even done some damage to one in that space. I had the entire Robotic Sandbox area filter out after me, as well as dealing with all of the loading bay enemies. It took a lot of effort to not go down, but the Hole Cracker ended up saving me for majority of that. Before taking out the Bastion, I recommend using the Hole Cracker to aggro it to you. Let it path over to you until it's pretty close, and then use the Hole Cracker to target one of the yellow joints on its leg until it detonates, and that will immobilize the Bastion for 10 full seconds. Once the Bastion is immobilized, mantle onto its head, place the deadline in the direct center of the head where the circular plate is, and then get yourself back to safety. You really need to make sure that you're behind a solid piece of cover, as once that deadline goes off, if you're in line of sight and within the 10 meters, it's going to knock you out. Once you've finished up with loading bay and you've taken out the Bastion and everything else that came with it, you have a couple of options. You can rotate into the robotic sandboxes like I did, or rotate out to the medical bay. It really is just dependent on what your game is like and where you hear or see other raiders playing. Now, from this point, you really do want to prioritize the shredder spawns, and shredders will spawn in almost every major area of the map. You will have 4 total in the medical area, 3 that will spawn inside of the medical bay, and then 1 that spawns just outside of it. 1 shredder will spawn in the loading bay, protecting one of the extracts. 2 will spawn in the atrium, depending on your RNG. 2 will spawn in the lobby. 1 in the business center, also related to RNG. 3 in the cultural archives. 1 in Metro, RNG dependent. 2 in robotic sandbox A. 1 in robotic sandbox B. 1 in the control room above the robotic sandboxes. And 1 that will spawn in the seed vault extraction midway through the game, also dependent on your RNG. There's genuinely no real right way to rotate or to build a rotation that is going to be perfect for every round. You do need to be dynamic to where you're hearing other raiders fighting and where the shredders are spawning during your round. I tend to rotate through a few of the areas regularly, and then will only rotate out if I'm finding that there's other raiders in the area or I'm just not getting the spawns that I expect. My preferred rotation is usually the cultural archives, into business center, over to atrium, down into lobby, down back into metro, and then into the robotic sandboxes and the control room above it, and then back into the cultural archives. This overall rotation usually takes enough time that the shredders will respawn in the areas that I've just come from. But sometimes if you hear a shredder spawned in a different space, like if I'm down in the robotic sandboxes or the metro area and I hear there's shredders up in the lobby, I will use my snap hook to go back up in the lobby so I can pick those off. You do really need to pay attention to the audio cues and where you're hearing the shredders spawn in to make sure that you can change your rotation on the fly to where you need to go. Now, I mentioned that Stella can be very PvP heavy, and I ran into a single raider that wanted to actually PvP in this game. Most of the round was okay, but about halfway through, a raider started to shoot me when I came up into the lobby area. Now, you have essentially 2 options once you get shot by another raider. If you really want to try to avoid ever going into an aggression-based type of lobby, your only choice is to run away. And I don't really recommend doing that unless you're extremely, extremely good with your movement and know how to get through the spaces a lot better than they can. If you shoot back against that raider, even if you're shot first, you will have some level of aggression-based matchmaking placed onto you, and you're going to find yourself in more PvP-focused lobbies during your next few rounds. I unfortunately made this mistake when I thought that they said that you could defend yourself and not be punished for it, and I have essentially been in PvP lobbies for the past 2 weeks with no real recourse for getting out. I've also made the choice that I'm not just going to just run away anymore. I'm just going to fight back when raiders shoot at me, and that is what I've decided to do in this game. It was pretty tough to figure out which raider was shooting me because there was a couple of players in the lobby just having a good old time. They were on a good one that night. And so it was very tough for me in the lobby to figure out which player it was. Thankfully, those players that were having a good time didn't take it personal when I shot them a couple times. And then the player that was attacking me flashed their flashlight at me, and I thought that meant they were calling a truce. I really just wanted to get back to fighting the shredders. I didn't want to waste my time in that fight, so I accepted the truce and went about my business. Now, I figured that player was going to come back around, and they eventually did when I was making my way through the robotic sandbox. Now, I'm going to be straight up and honest with y'all. I didn't play this all that great. There were a lot of mistakes that I made, especially with it being at night and me not having a ton of visibility in what was going on. I also feel like the movement and the weapon swapping and the gadget use on controller is a little bit clunky, and I don't really like PvP in this game for that reason. It feels like whenever I swap to a weapon or I swap to a gadget, it just takes so long for that thing to come out. And I feel like I just need it to be quicker and more responsive for me to feel a lot more comfortable in the fight. So instead of really focusing on how to be the best PvP player, I want to talk about how I use playing a little bit passively and how I use my movement to really end up giving me the win in this fight. So if a player attacks you, your goal is to try and disengage, break line of sight, so you can heal up and shield up as much as necessary. Most PvP players that play a little bit ratty and will just shoot you in the back when you're PvEing are not necessarily the brightest players in the game, and they're not necessarily the best at PvP. They just thrive on the fact that players that they're fighting are not fighting back. And if you show any sort of competence in playing a PvP fight, you will actually find that you're going to be better than most players. I kept kiting this player into an area where I could funnel them into a line of fire, and then I got blindsided by a pop, which totally ruined my rotation. For whatever reason, the player didn't push in once the pop exploded, and I was able to use some healing and get myself healed back up. I literally tried to swap back to the Venator, which I put away when I swapped to my healing gadget, and for whatever reason, the game brought out the hole cracker, so I bonked the player in their chest with a hole cracker round. I have no idea if that actually does any sort of damage, but at that point, I knew that I was in trouble, so I rotated back around, jumped over the console, and headed back out the door and shut the door. Continuing to disengage and heal myself so I could get a better angle was the play. I took a second to kind of heal up and reload, and then I knew that I had no choice but to take this fight. Whenever you are fighting somebody, your best choice is to try and attack them from an angle they're not expecting. So my goal when I jumped up on top of the cabinet was to hit them from that angle where they weren't ready for it. They did some good damage to me, and I didn't know that I did good damage to them, so I was actually trying to disengage by jumping off the ledge, and I saw that they were doing the same thing at the same time, and that told me they were just as hurt as I was, which gave me the confidence to take a few more shots, and I was able to knock that player out. Now, once you've knocked a player out, especially if they're not like right by you and you can't just finish them up, I recommend focusing on your healing and just getting back to the rotation. The odds of them getting themselves back up is very low, and if you try and chase them, you're probably going to pull an enemy like the pop that was waiting for me at the bottom. My real focus at that point was just getting back into the rotation. After that fight with that player, I didn't run into any more PvP throughout the game, and I was able to continue my rotation throughout Stella. The score I got overall, it's pretty decent, and I'm happy with it in general, but it definitely would have been a little bit higher if I didn't spend that time in that fight, and I had better RNG for the spawns. But that's just the way this game goes sometimes, and you just kind of have to roll with the punches and accept that it is what it is. Once you've stacked up enough points and you're happy with your score, head back to Speranza, collect any loot if you haven't already, and watch your score fly up the leaderboard. That's going to be it for me today, y'all. Thanks for watching.